The river moved slow that summer, heavy with silt and memory, its waters carrying whispers of the lands it cut through. On the high bluff above Natchez stood the Harrowby house, white columns gleaming even as the paint peeled in strips under the relentless sun. To those drifting on flatboats below, it must have seemed a palace set against the dark green of the trees, a monument to wealth and permanence. But closer, within the reach of its shadow, the house showed its cracks. Floorboards groaned at night, shutters rattled in storms, and in the attic rats gnawed through cedar chests once filled with silks brought up from New Orleans. The scent of magnolia mixed with the harsher smell of sweat, tobacco, and cane sugar ground into the very bones of the place. Inside, the Harrowbys lived with the ease of those who believed the world had been carved for their comfort. John Harrowby, master of the estate, carried his cruelty like a weapon sharpened daily. His wife, Eliza, moved through the house in silks, her voice quick with commands, her eyes sharp with suspicion. Their sons rode horses hard, their laughter shrill when they watched the overseer's whip crack across a back. Their daughters practiced the piano in the parlor, hands delicate on the keys even as their mouths repeated the coldness they heard at the table. The family feasted on plenty while the quarters stood lean, voices hushed after dark. Among the enslaved, Clara kept to the kitchen, her world bounded by hearth and smoke, knives worn smooth by years of use, pots blackened by fire. She rarely raised her voice, yet everyone noticed how nothing escaped her gaze. She remembered every order, every slight, every word muttered under breath when the Harrowbys thought no one was listening. To the family she was silent obedience. To the others she was something different, though none dared name it aloud. Her hands moved with practiced calm, folding dough, trimming meat, stirring stews that fed both body and illusion. The cruelty of the Harrowbys was not always loud. Sometimes it came in the small ways, like Eliza demanding Clara scrub the silver twice though it gleamed already, or the eldest son tipping over a bowl simply because he could. Other times it came like thunder, an overseer's lash, a boy sold off in town, a girl sent into the big house and returning with eyes that would not meet anyone's. These were the things that soaked into Clara's bones, layered and layered until they became weight. She did not speak of it, but the quiet in her was not the quiet of submission. It was the quiet of someone listening, collecting, biding. The bluff itself seemed to share the house's secrets. At night the cicadas sang so loud it was like the land itself cried out. The wind off the river carried voices strange and half-formed, as though the waters remembered those who had been thrown into them. The quarters sat low, half-sunk in earth, smoke curling thin from chimneys, children huddled close to mothers. There were stories whispered after dark, of old ways carried across the sea, of poisons made from roots, of spirits that waited in the woods. Clara listened, her face still, her hands folding cloth or grinding herbs for cooking. She stored those whispers alongside the insults, the blows, the screams muffled by closed shutters. In the dining room, candles flickered against polished wood, lighting the silver and crystal that marked each supper. The Harrowbys laughed loud over venison, gumbo, roasted birds, their voices carrying through the house as if they owned not just land, but air itself. Clara moved in and out of sight, filling glasses, laying platters, clearing plates. Her steps made no sound, but her presence was constant, like the ticking of the tall clock in the corner. She knew the rhythms of the family's greed, when they would demand more, when they would grow restless, when they would retreat into the parlor to speak of crops and politics. To them she was furniture that served. To herself she was a mind that remembered. The land around the house was wide and unforgiving. Cotton fields stretched far, green turning to white as the season ripened, each bowl picked by bent backs under the overseer's eye. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and crushed plants. In the distance, the riverboats whistled, carrying fortunes made on the work of those who would never touch that wealth. At dusk, the fields emptied, and the quarters filled with tired bodies and low voices. Yet in the kitchen, the work never ceased. Clara stayed long after the family had gone to their feather beds, cleaning, preparing, setting aside. It was in those hours, with only embers for light, that her thoughts gathered like storm clouds. The Harrowby house on the bluff looked solid, as if it had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. But wood rots, plaster cracks, families fall? Clara knew this in her bones, though she spoke it to no one. She saw how the master's hand shook when he drank too much, how Eliza's face lined early from suspicion, how the sons quarreled, how the daughters whispered cruel things about each other when they thought no one heard. The house stood tall, but the foundation was already weakening. All it needed was a hand steady enough to bring it down. Clara did not rush. She measured. She waited. She listened as the river slid by, patient, knowing its time always came. Morning always began in darkness. The rooster crowed faint, but the sound of iron scraping against the hearth came first. Clara rose before the others, her body moving out of habit, her hands already reaching for the firewood stacked by the door. The kitchen filled with smoke as flames took hold, crackling low, sparks lifting like restless spirits before vanishing into the air. She stirred coals, laid heavy pots across the grates, and began the work that fed both the Harrowby family and the lie of their greatness. Cornmeal, lard, and salt shaped into bread that would harden by noon. Coffee ground bitter, the scent sharp enough to wake even before it touched the tongue. Meat salted months before, now fried in grease until the smell filled every corner of the house. It was the same every day, the same rhythm carried out with unchanging precision. Yet within the motions, Clara's mind never rested. Each pinch of seasoning, each cut of the knife, each drop of oil was measured not only for taste, but for knowledge. She had learned how much could be hidden, how something bitter could be softened by sugar, how something sharp could be buried under spice. The others noticed her quiet care. A boy once whispered that Clara's eyes were like deep water, dark enough to drown in if you looked too long. At night, when the work was done and the Harrowbys slept, the enslaved sat close in the quarters, voices low, trading stories as old as memory. Some spoke of Africa, lands none of them had seen but all of them felt in their bones. They spoke of plants that cured fevers, leaves that eased pain, powders that ended suffering. The old ones told of charms buried in corners, bottles hung in trees, roots tied at the waist to keep evil away. These were not tales for children alone. They were a language of survival, spoken in whispers that white ears dismissed as nonsense. Clara never laughed when they spoke. She listened, head bent, hands busy with cloth or herbs she claimed were for cooking. She carried every word into herself and set it beside what she already knew. She had seen the mistress's medicine cabinet, glass jars labeled with Latin words, bottles of tinctures ordered from apothecaries in the city. She had noticed which powders made the master sleep, which drops eased his aching joints, which mixtures caused him to sweat through his shirt. She compared those medicines with the roots she knew, the teas she had brewed for fevers in the quarters, the bitter leaves that cleansed the body. She understood that sickness and healing were two sides of the same blade, and whoever held the blade decided how it would be used. The Harrowbys never thought of this. To them, Clara was only hands that cooked, a body that bent to their will. They did not see how she measured them as carefully as she measured her spices. The way John Harrowby grew red when angry, the way Eliza's voice sharpened when she suspected disobedience, the way the sons strutted after drink, the way the daughters clung to their mother's skirts and whispered spite. Every detail was stored away, filed like recipes to be recalled at the right time. One night, when the moon was full and pale, Clara sat by the kitchen hearth long after the others had gone to bed. She crushed seeds between stones, her hands steady, her face calm. The sound was soft but clear, like bones breaking far away. The air smelled sharp, bitter, dangerous. She did not taste it, did not need to. She wrapped the powder in cloth, tied it tight, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. It was not yet time. She would not waste it on a single moment of rage. She was patient as the river, waiting for the day when the current would shift. In the quarters, the whispers grew bold. Someone said the master's face had gone pale after supper one night, that he staggered as though the earth tilted beneath him. Another said Eliza had complained of her stomach, though she blamed the oysters sent up from New Orleans. The overseer once spat blood into the dirt, muttering curses before dragging himself upright. No one named Clara, but eyes turned toward her with quiet wonder and perhaps fear. She gave them nothing back, no nod, no smile, no word. Silence was her shield, and within it she carried all the power she needed. Every morning the work began again. Bread rose, beans boiled, meat turned on spits. The Harrowbys never questioned the meals placed before them, never wondered at the hands that prepared each bite. They had built their lives on the belief that those hands belonged to them, that obedience was nature itself. They did not see the truth. They did not know that each dish could carry more than flavor, that the kitchen itself could become a battlefield where no blade was seen, no gun was fired, and yet death waited. Clara knew. She moved through her days with the calm of someone who understood the weapon she held was not iron but knowledge. And knowledge could not be taken from her by whip or chain. Outside, the bluff loomed over the river, steady and unmoving. The house stood tall, its columns white against the sky, a symbol of permanence in the eyes of those who lived within. But the earth beneath was soft with water, and the river never stopped pressing. Clara carried that truth inside her, quiet and unshaken. She listened to the whispers, to the stories, to the warnings carried by wind and fire. Each night she folded them into herself until her silence was no longer emptiness but weight, a weight heavy enough to crush the house when the time came. The air grew thick with heat as summer deepened, and the house on the bluff took on the smell of mildew beneath the polish, of damp wood hidden under plaster. Days stretched long, the fields heavy with cotton, the river slow and swollen. It was then the word spread through the house that the eldest son was coming back from New Orleans, and there would be a great supper to mark his return. The Harrowbys ordered new linens, fresh candles, and enough food to remind their guests of their power. For Clara, it was the moment she had been waiting for, though no one around her could see it yet. The house buzzed with preparation. The daughters picked through gowns, arguing over lace and ribbons. Eliza sent letters into town demanding oysters, wine, and sugar. John paced the hall, barking instructions at the overseer, ensuring that the yard would be neat, the stables swept, the quarters silent. To the Harrowbys, this feast was not just a celebration, but a display, a stage on which they would remind everyone in Natchez of their standing. They thought only of how their guests would admire the columns, the parlor, the laughter around the table. None of them thought of the kitchen, or of the woman who would shape the meal itself. Clara stood at the center of that kitchen, her face calm as she sorted herbs, sharpened knives, and measured flour. She listened as the family made their endless demands, nodded when spoken to, answered softly. But inside her mind the pieces had begun to align. She knew the house would be full, that the food would be eaten in abundance, that wine would flow until tongues loosened and judgment dimmed. She knew it was a night no one would question the cook, a night when every dish would be praised, when the Harrowbys would open themselves wide in pride and leave themselves exposed. She began to set things aside. She dried leaves slowly over the fire until they turned to ash, ground seeds into fine powder with the pestle, tucked away jars at the back of the shelf where no one else reached. She steeped bitter roots until their taste nearly vanished under strong spice. She knew how to hide sharpness with sweetness, how to fold something dangerous into something desired. Every motion was measured, every act hidden under the endless labor expected of her. To any who watched, Clara was only doing her duty. To herself, she was preparing a supper unlike any the house had seen. The enslaved around her felt the change, though none spoke it plain. They noticed how her eyes lingered on the table, how her hands moved slower at night, as if she were shaping more than food. Some feared the weight of it, whispering that the walls had ears, that the valley punished those who struck too boldly. Others felt a strange thrill, the kind that rises before a storm breaks. They did not ask questions, but they watched her, carrying their own hope or dread in silence. On the day of the feast, the house glowed with activity. Lamps polished, floors scrubbed until they shone. The smell of roasting meat drifted through every hall, mixed with garlic, onions, and spice. The clatter of pots filled the kitchen, the hiss of fat, the rhythm of knives against boards. Clara moved among it all, steady and deliberate. She lifted trays, basted roasts, stirred pots with calm care. No one saw the moment when the powders slipped from her hand, when the bitter herbs dissolved into the broth, when the hidden taste blended so perfectly with the flavors the Harrowbys loved. It was all done as part of the work, invisible because no one thought to look. By afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Carriages rolled up the dirt road, wheels creaking, horses tossing their heads. Fine coats, lace collars, jewels flashing in the sun. Laughter at the door, greetings loud enough to fill the halls. The family swelled with pride, showing off their home, their land, their supposed gentility. The dining room was set in grandeur, candles standing tall, crystal catching the light, silver polished so bright it nearly blinded. The table bowed beneath dishes, each plate carefully arranged, each bowl steaming. Clara stood in the shadows of the kitchen doorway, watching as the guests took their seats, as wine was poured and hands clapped in welcome. She carried trays in and out, silent, her face composed. None looked her in the eye. None thought of the hands that had made the feast possible. They spoke instead of politics, of trade, of fashion in the city. They raised glasses, toasted to fortune, to family, to the future. In Clara's mind, the voices from the quarters stirred. Old stories of balance, of the world turning upon itself when wrongs grew too heavy. She thought of every backscarred, every child stolen, every night spent in hunger or fear. She thought of how the Harrowbys laughed above it all, believing themselves untouchable. She felt the weight of what she had placed before them, and knew the night would end differently than they dreamed. The candles burned brighter as dusk settled, the room alive with laughter and chatter. The first course was served, and Clara moved among them, her steps sure, her hands steady. The Harrowbys did not notice the stillness in her eyes, the silence that had become her shield. They lifted spoons and forks, filled their mouths with the food she had shaped. The feast had begun, and with it the reckoning she had carried in silence for so long. The dining room glowed with a feverish light, candles bending under their own wax, flames trembling as if they too sensed the heaviness in the air. The Harrowbys laughed without caution, their voices rising above the clink of silver and the scrape of knives against porcelain. Glasses clashed in toast after toast, wine spilling over polished rims onto the embroidered cloth. To anyone looking in, it was nothing more than a scene of wealth and celebration, a family surrounded by friends, basking in the splendor of their position. But beneath that brightness, something darker was already moving, slow as dusk rolling across a field. Clara moved among them like a shadow stitched to the room. She filled glasses, laid down plates, removed bones from sight. No one thanked her. They spoke around her as though she were furniture, a useful piece of wood that moved when needed and vanished when not. Her face was calm, but her ears heard every boast, every cruel remark, every casual mention of flesh and price. Their words were salt ground into wounds that had never healed, yet Clara showed no flinch, no sign. She let their arrogance swell, knowing pride would be their last comfort. The first to falter was a cousin, his voice cutting mid-laughter into a dry cough. He waved off concern, insisting the oysters had gone down wrong. Yet his face paled, a sheen of sweat beading across his temple. He reached for his glass, drained it too quickly, and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. Conversation flowed on, eager to return to merriment, but the pause had already planted unease. Clara saw it, though her gaze never lingered long enough to draw suspicion. Minutes later, another guest set down her fork, her smile thinning. She pressed a hand to her stomach, muttered something about the heat, and leaned against her husband's arm. Across the table, John Harrowby barked a laugh too loud, trying to cover the silence creeping in. He called for more wine, demanded music, ordered the evening to march forward like soldiers on a field. But the shadows had entered, and no command could keep them out. The smell of roasted meat clung heavy in the air, mingling with perfume and tobacco smoke. What once seemed rich now turned oppressive, as if the feast itself rebelled against those who consumed it. The laughter softened, replaced by the shifting of chairs, the faint clatter of dropped utensils. More hands pressed against stomachs, more faces drained of color. The room that had begun as a monument to joy now trembled on the edge of disorder. Clara's steps remained steady. She cleared empty plates, offered fresh bread, poured another round of wine. Her hands did not shake. Her eyes betrayed no flicker of satisfaction. She knew the timing, knew that what began as discomfort would deepen as the night stretched long. She had measured it with care, weighed it against patience, ensured that the suffering would spread like ink through water, impossible to contain once begun. The Harrowbys tried to keep the evening alive. Eliza fluttered about with false cheer, insisting the oysters must have been bad, insisting nothing was wrong with the rest of the food. Her voice carried a tremor, though she fought to hide it. John's jaw clenched as he forced more wine into his glass, his pride unwilling to admit weakness, his anger burning at the thought that something beyond his command could ruin the night. He swore it was coincidence, that guests were weak, that the heat was to blame. But his own face flushed red, then pale, and a muscle in his cheek twitched without pause. The room filled with murmurs, questions, the uneasy rustle of silk and linen as guests shifted in their seats. Servants were summoned to open windows, to fetch fans, to bring cool water from the well. The night air drifted in, but it carried no relief, only the heavy scent of earth and magnolia. The cicadas outside wailed as if marking the moment, their droning chorus rising and falling like a dirge. Clara returned to the kitchen only briefly, standing in the warm darkness while the sounds from the dining room reached her. She closed her eyes and let the noise wash over her, the coughs, the low groans, the clink of glasses now more desperate than celebratory. It was a music of its own, built from the collapse of arrogance, the unraveling of certainty. She drew one long breath, then lifted the next tray and returned to the room, the image of composure itself. By the time dessert was served, the feast had split into two worlds. In one, the determined laughter of the hosts clung stubbornly, a brittle shell over crumbling pride. In the other, faces strained and bodies shifted, sickness gnawing beneath lace and velvet. No one dared to accuse. To speak suspicion would be to open a door none wished to see beyond. And so they held their silence, convincing themselves that nothing more than chance had turned celebration into unease. But Clara knew the truth. She saw it in the trembling hands that lifted forks, in the sheen of sweat across brows, in the eyes darting toward the door as though escape could undo what had already begun. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to the weight of the supper, to the shadow she had woven into every bite. They had given her their trust without thought, and she had transformed it into something they could neither see nor stop. As the clock in the hallway struck midnight, a hush fell across the room. The feast had ended, though none would say it aloud. The guests lingered in dread, the Harrowbys clinging to a crumbling veneer of order. And Clara, silent and unseen, cleared the table with the patience of someone who knew this night was not an end, but a beginning. The house lay heavy after the feast, its grandeur dimmed by the weight of unease. Guests retired to chambers prepared for them, but rest did not come easily. The walls carried the echoes of strained laughter and muffled coughs, of glasses set down too sharply, of chairs scraping against polished floors. The candles had burned low, their smoke curling into corners like the remnants of whispered doubts. Outside, the cicadas gave way to frogs in the marsh, their throats swelling with calls that broke the stillness of the night. Clara moved through the halls with the same calm steps she had carried all day. She gathered plates left behind, lifted cups stained with wine, and carried trays to the kitchen without a sound. Her hands knew their work, and the rhythm of her labor steadied her. But behind her steady pace was the awareness of the slow unraveling taking place in every room above. She could feel it like a storm pressing down on the roof, invisible yet certain. In the chambers of the house, the first signs grew sharper. A cousin tossed on his mattress, his breath ragged between waves of nausea. A young woman pressed her face into a pillow to hide her groans, her silk gown damp with sweat. John Harrowby sat on the edge of his bed, fists clenched, insisting to his wife that it was only the oysters, only the wine, only the heat. His words came harder as his stomach twisted, his pride crumbling against the reality his body betrayed. Eliza wept quietly in the dark, her prayers tangled, her voice asking for mercy from a God who had long been deaf to mercy in that house. The night stretched on without rest. Servants were sent for water, for cloths soaked to cool fevered brows, for remedies from old bottles left forgotten in cupboards. None of it eased the pain. The poison wound through veins without haste, deliberate as footsteps across a long hall. It gave no relief, only deepening waves, a sickness that pressed down until even the strongest grew small beneath it. Clara remained unseen in much of it, though her presence was everywhere. She walked the kitchen, tidying, her movements unhurried. She wiped tables clean, stacked plates, swept ash from the hearth. She paused only once, standing with her hands braced on the edge of the counter, eyes closed. In the distance, she heard a door slam open, a cry break through, the hurried steps of someone rushing to fetch aid. She listened, steady, as though the house itself spoke to her in a language no one else could hear. The enslaved whispered in the quarters, word reaching them like sparks carried on the wind. They spoke of sickness spreading among the masters, of Clara's still face at the supper, of old stories where justice arrived not by sword or fire, but by root and leaf. Some crossed themselves, fearing the curse that might fall upon them all. Others smiled faintly in the dark, a smile born of long-buried hope, of the thought that the order of things might not be unshakable after all. But none dared speak too loud, for the night was not yet finished, and ears were always near. In one chamber, a guest tried to rise from bed, determined to leave before dawn, but collapsed before he reached the door. In another, a child whimpered as his mother shushed him, though she herself could hardly draw breath without trembling. Across the hall, John shouted for a doctor, though his voice broke midway into a cough so harsh it left blood on his handkerchief. The household clung to denial even as their bodies betrayed them. They refused to name what was happening, refused to believe that the seat of their pride could be undone by what had been set before them at their own table. The hours between midnight and dawn passed slowly, each one marked by a fresh sound, the thud of someone falling, the cry of a woman in distress, the hollow retching that carried down the stairwell. The lamps burned low, oil running thin, shadows stretching long across the floors. Every corner of the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when denial would collapse entirely and the truth would settle over them all. Clara sat alone for a time, her back against the wall of the kitchen, the cool stone pressing against her. She closed her eyes and thought of the river, of how it carried everything in time, no matter how heavy. She thought of the faces of those who had gone before her, the ones who had bent beneath the same yoke, who had prayed for some hand to strike balance. She did not smile, nor did she weep. She only breathed, steady as the ticking of the clock in the hall above. When the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon, it fell upon a house that no longer held its former strength. Guests lay weakened in their beds, the Harrowbys themselves broken under the weight of their bodies' betrayal. The servants moved quietly, their faces unreadable, their hands carrying water and cloth, their silence louder than words. And Clara, standing at the kitchen window, watched the river catch the new light. She did not need to see the rooms above to know what the morning would bring. The supper had done its work, and the silent hours had delivered its truth. The first light of morning crept over the Mississippi, a pale wash that turned the river silver and the fog a dull gray. Birds stirred in the trees, their songs sharp against the silence that hung over the Harrowby house. What had begun as celebration the night before had ended in a sickness that no laughter or prayer could cover. With the sun came the full weight of what the night had sown. Servants moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps hushed, their eyes lowered. They carried basins of water, cloths damp with coolness, buckets for the filth that could not be contained. The sound of retching echoed from chamber to chamber, a grim chorus that made even the strongest turn away. Doors opened and closed with urgency, voices calling for relief that would not come. The house that had once strutted with pride now staggered beneath the strain of its own grandeur, every gilded frame and polished floor useless in the face of what lay within. John Harrowby had not slept. He sat hunched in a chair beside the great bed, his hair damp with sweat, his face hollowed by pain. His pride still burned, but it sputtered like a flame starving for air. He barked orders at anyone who came near, his voice ragged, his demands laced with fear. He shouted for the doctor, for medicines, for remedies that no hand could provide. He swore it was chance, swore it was the oysters, swore it was nothing more than misfortune. Yet his hand trembled as he pressed it to his gut, and the cloth at his lips bore the red stain of truth. Eliza drifted in and out of sobs, her body too weak to hold the full weight of despair. She clutched rosary beads until they left marks in her palms, whispered prayers that tangled into cries. She looked at her husband, at her children, at the guests stricken in their beds, and in her eyes grew the terror that this house, which had once seemed untouchable, could crumble like ash in the wind. She reached for Faith, but her faith gave no answer. The children fared no better. Their cries pierced the halls, high and thin, voices unused to such suffering. Some called for their mothers, others for comfort that no hand could offer. The young son, who had returned from New Orleans to be honored, lay doubled in agony, his fine suit abandoned for linen soaked through with sweat. His face, once proud with city airs, twisted in pain until he was no different from the poorest man on the street. Guests who had come to celebrate now found themselves prisoners of the house, too sick to leave, too broken to rise. Some whispered of curses, of judgment called down upon them, of sins paid in flesh. Others clung to the hope that dawn itself would bring relief, that light would drive away what darkness had sown. Yet as the hours passed, their hope thinned, and silence grew heavier. Clara moved among them with the same steady grace as before. She carried water, emptied basins, adjusted sheets. No one looked into her face long enough to see the calm in her eyes, for they were too consumed by their own suffering. To them she was only a shadow, a pair of hands that lifted and carried, a presence unnoticed until needed. She offered no comfort, no word of solace, only the service expected of her. Yet within her chest beat a quiet certainty, a knowledge that what had been planted was blossoming into full shape. Outside, the world carried on as if untouched. The fields stretched wide, the cotton waiting for hands to gather it. The river drifted southward, steady and unconcerned. The quarters stirred with whispers as word of the sickness spread. Men and women glanced at one another with eyes that dared not speak too loudly, but in their silence lay a spark. For years they had seen the Harrowbys as immovable, their rule as unending. Now they watched as that power bent beneath the weight of what no whip, no law, no prayer could stop. By midday the doctor arrived, summoned from town with urgency. His carriage rattled up the road, his face drawn as he entered the house. He moved from room to room, his hands pressing stomachs, his eyes narrowing at fevers that burned too high. He muttered words of food poisoning, of spoiled meat, of poor storage. He gave powders, tinctures, assurances that the sickness would pass. Yet even he could not hide the unease that settled in his eyes when he saw the scale of it, when he counted how many lay broken in their beds. The house tried to cling to order. Servants rushed with orders, furniture shifted to make space for the sick, windows thrown open to draw in air. But the air itself seemed thick, heavy with the stench of sweat and sickness, a smell that clung to every curtain, every sheet, every breath. The grandeur of the mansion turned hollow, its beauty drowned beneath the sound of groans and the sight of pale faces. Clara stood once more at the kitchen window as the sun reached its height, her hands resting on the sill. She watched the yard, the road leading into town, the stretch of sky that seemed so wide above it all. She thought of the long years behind her, of the endless days of labor and silence. She thought of the supper, of the laughter that had filled the house, of the moment it had shifted into something darker. She thought of the balance now tipping, of the weight of history bending if only for a moment. toward something like justice. In the rooms above, the cries grew weaker, the house settling into the long rhythm of suffering. No prayer rose loud enough to drown it, no power strong enough to halt it. The Harrowbys had built their lives on the backs of others, and now their feast had turned against them. Daylight revealed what night had hidden, and with it came the truth that nothing they held could shield them from the hand that had moved unseen at their own table. By the second night, the house no longer pretended. What had been dismissed as spoiled oysters or summer heat was revealed as something deeper, something no tonic or prayer could chase away. The Harrowbys and their guests lay in their chambers, bodies wasted by waves of sickness, their voices thin, their faces hollow. The mansion, once proud with music and laughter, now echoed with groans that rose and fell like the wind through broken reeds. The doctor returned with more bottles and powders, his hands shaking as he tried to force reason upon what he could not cure. He spoke of purging the body, of bleeding to balance humors, of bitter herbs to drive out the illness. Servants obeyed his instructions, fetching buckets and cloths, heating water for poultices, emptying basins filled with what could no longer be held. Yet no matter what was done, the suffering deepened. The more they strained to save themselves, the further they sank into weakness. John Harrowby clung to pride even as it slipped from him like sand. He tried to rise from his bed, to bark orders with the authority he had carried his whole life. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed onto the floor, striking his head against the edge of a table. Servants lifted him back, but his command was broken, his voice slurred with fever, his body trembling beyond his will. Still, he tried to deny the truth, swearing the sickness was chance, swearing the house would stand, swearing he could not be undone. His words rang hollow in ears that had heard too many cries already. Eliza drifted between prayer and despair, her lips moving without sense, her hands clutched around beads that slipped through trembling fingers. She called out for saints, for angels, for mercy, her voice cracking each time the silence answered. She looked at her children, at her guests, at her husband pale and broken beside her, and the sight hollowed her soul. The house that had once seemed like a fortress of power now stood like a tomb filled with whispers. The children suffered as well. Their cries thinned into whimpers, their limbs limp against damp sheets. The eldest son, once full of city airs and arrogance, now lay curled and weak, his body soiled, his breath shallow. The younger ones wept until no tears remained, their faces pale, their small hands clutching at their mother's skirts for comfort she could not give. What wealth, what privilege, what pride could protect them now? Nothing shielded them from the same fate that bound the rest. Guests who had arrived in fine coats and gowns no longer resembled themselves. Their silks were stained, their hair matted, their dignity stripped away by sickness. Some begged to be carried home, but their bodies would not rise. Others whispered of curses, of hidden vengeance, of sins catching up to flesh. They feared the walls themselves had turned against them, that the house was no longer a sanctuary, but a place of judgment. Clara moved through it all like a figure drawn in shadow, her steps soft, her hands steady. She tended without expression, carrying water, wiping brows, folding soiled linens. No one dared look too deeply into her eyes, for to do so might have revealed a truth too sharp to bear. To them, she was still the cook, the servant, the woman who had always been silent. They did not see that silence now as power, did not understand that each calm movement was the fulfillment of something larger than their imagination could hold. In the quarters, the whispers spread further. Men and women gathered in small groups, speaking low as the night wrapped around them. Some feared retribution, that the sickness would spill over, that punishment would fall upon them all. Others felt the stir of something long buried, a trembling in their chests that was not fear but something close to freedom. They knew not what the next days would bring, only that the order they had been forced to bow to was cracking, and once cracked, it could not be restored whole. The house smelled of sickness now, heavy and sour, a stench that clung to wood and fabric alike. No perfume, no polish, no candle could drive it out. The grand hall, once filled with laughter and dance, lay silent, its chandeliers dark, its floor echoing only with the shuffle of feet carrying basins and cloths. The dining room where the feast had begun sat abandoned, dishes still unwashed, wine dried into stains across the cloth. What had once been a stage for pride was now nothing but a reminder of the moment where fortune turned. The nights dragged, each one longer than the last. The cries weakened, the silences grew heavier, the weight of inevitability pressing down until even the strongest spirit bent beneath it. Some slipped into stillness without notice, their bodies carried quietly from chambers, their names whispered once before silence claimed them. Others lingered, clinging to life with gasps and groans, their suffering stretching like thread pulled thin. Clara alone did not falter. She walked the halls with her measured steps, her eyes calm, her face unreadable. She had no need for words, for the truth was written across every bed, every pale face, every breath drawn shallow. What she had begun had become something larger than herself, a tide rolling through the house with a will of its own. She did not resist it, nor did she hurry it. She let it unfold, patient as the river carving its path through stone. And so the Harrowby house stood in those days, neither alive with joy nor fully fallen, caught in the long dying. It was a place where power had turned inward, devouring itself, where pride lay broken across sweat-soaked sheets, where silence reigned louder than any command. The world beyond still moved, the river flowing, the fields waiting. But within those walls time seemed to stretch, each hour an eternity. Each breath a question of how much longer it could last. The morning broke pale and thin, its light spilling over the Mississippi like milk poured into dark water. The river carried on as always, its steady current indifferent to the cries that had filled the Harrowby house through the long night. By then the mansion was hushed, not by peace but by exhaustion, the kind that hollowed faces and left bodies limp where they lay. Death had already visited in the dark, carrying away 2 guests and a child, their passing marked by gasps that faded into stillness. Sheets were drawn over them, prayers mumbled, but no real hope clung to the living anymore. John Harrowby lay sunk deep into his bed, his skin waxen, his voice barely more than a rasp. He muttered fragments of words, half curses, half pleas, as if he still believed his wealth could strike bargains even at death's door. Beside him, Eliza clutched his hand, though her own strength was spent. She no longer prayed aloud, her lips only moving with the rhythm of old habits. Her eyes stared ahead, not at her husband, not at the doctor hovering uselessly nearby, but at something far away, some truth that had grown too sharp to deny. The guests who remained alive barely resembled the proud company who had arrived in silk and satin. Their garments were ruined, their hair unkempt, their dignity stripped as thoroughly as their health. Some lay in corners of the great hall on makeshift beds, too weak to return to their chambers. Others sat slumped in chairs, trembling hands clutching cups of water as if it were gold. The house that had once symbolized grandeur now resembled a hospice, its fine rugs and polished floors stained with the evidence of suffering. Servants moved silently, their faces set, their motions steady. They knew the house was crumbling, yet they carried out their duties with care, each task performed as if part of a ritual meant to ease the passage of a dying order. Among them, Clara moved most often, her presence constant yet unobtrusive. She poured drinks, adjusted pillows, wiped brows with cloths cooled in basins. To every eye she seemed loyal beyond measure, the last pillar holding up a house that had lost its strength. None understood that she was the architect of its ruin, nor that her calm came from certainty, not from service. By midday, the doctor admitted what he had denied for days. He could do nothing. His tools, his medicines, his years of training were powerless before what was consuming the house. He spoke of providence, of mysteries beyond human grasp, his words heavy with the sound of failure. He packed his case slowly, his hands trembling, then left without looking back, unwilling to watch his patients sink further into death. The family had once leaned on his authority. Now even that prop was gone. John Harrowby died before the sun set. His final breath rattled out like a broken hinge, his eyes rolling back as his body sagged against the bed. Eliza let out a sound that was neither cry nor word, just a low moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. She did not let go of his hand even when it grew cold. She stayed there, her body still as stone, as if leaving him would mean admitting that her own end was near. That night the house fell into silence deeper than any before. The children were still, the guests too weak to speak, the servants whispering only when necessary. Even the cicadas outside seemed hushed, their usual chorus softened as though the world itself was holding its breath. Clara walked the halls, her steps measured, her eyes steady. She stopped by each room, lingering a moment, listening to the shallow breathing or the silence within. She knew it was nearly finished. Eliza lasted 3 more days, her body clinging to life with the stubbornness of grief. She refused food, sipped only water when pressed, and spent her hours staring at the ceiling, her lips dry, her face pale as parchment. When she finally slipped away, it was without ceremony, her chest rising and falling until it simply did not rise again. Clara closed her eyes, smoothing the hair back from her damp forehead with a tenderness that was not feigned. For a moment, the 2 women were simply that. 2 women bound by loss, though one had carried her grief as fire and the other as chains. When the last guest died, the house was left to its echoes. The once proud estate stood hollow, its windows staring blank into the humid air, its rooms heavy with the memory of cries now gone. Servants moved like ghosts through its corridors, cleaning, gathering, carrying bodies out to be buried in ground that had already claimed too many lives. They worked with a quiet purpose, not for the family, but for themselves, for the promise of what might come after. Clara stood at the doorway one evening, looking out at the river. The sun dipped low, painting the water in red and gold, the same river that had carried her into bondage years before. Now it carried away the last traces of the Harrowbys' name, their wealth and cruelty dissolved into silence. She felt no triumph, no gloating pride, only a steady calm, the knowledge that the balance had shifted, that the weight of suffering had been answered in kind. Word spread quickly beyond the plantation. Neighbors spoke of curses, of divine punishment, of plagues sent by heaven. None spoke the truth, for none could see it. They feared what they could not name, comforted by the belief that fate and chance had claimed the Harrowbys. They did not imagine the quiet figure who had walked among them, pouring their wine, stirring their pots, standing unseen while the walls of their world collapsed. That was Clara's victory. Not only the fall of the household, but the blindness of those who would never know how it came to be. When at last the mansion emptied, when the last body was lowered into the earth, Clara returned to her kitchen. She set her hands on the table worn smooth by years of work, and she breathed. For the first time in her life, she felt no chain, no overseer's gaze, no weight pressing her down. The Harrowbys were gone, their line ended, their house broken, their power dissolved like sugar in water. She stood in the quiet and let the truth settle into her bones. The reckoning was complete.